So picture this. You're in a cutting-edge biomechanics lab, right? And they got these optical sensors sampling at like 200 times a second.
Right. Incredibly high resolution data.
Exactly. And this data recently proved that our entire modern high-performance training culture is, well, it's actually making us slower, less efficient, and way more prone to injury.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. But here's the craziest part. Their ultimate proof for this whole structural failure, it isn't some new piece of algorithmic modeling. It is literally a 500-year-old painting by Sandro Botticelli.
Yeah, I mean, it is a stunning collision of disciplines. You have the absolute bleeding edge of empirical movement science staring down a masterpiece from 15th century Florence.
Right.
And then realizing that this Renaissance painter understood the exact kinetic mechanisms that, we are only just now building the silicon to even measure.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are cracking open an incredibly dense and honestly, genuinely paradigm-shifting source.
It really is.
We're looking at this internal dossier presented by Dr. Christophe Delong and Kinetic Formation. And this document, it completely upends how we look at physical grace, athletic durability, and just general movement health.
Yeah, because Kinexa is a sports performance and biomechanics organization, right? But their dossier essentially argues that classical art and modern movement science are, well, they're the exact same discipline. They're just separated by a few centuries of vocabulary.
Yeah, it's fascinating. They're actively using the works of Botticelli as the ultimate literal blueprint for human movement.
Which, forces a total reevaluation of how human bodies navigate space and tension. The backdrop of our entire analysis today is this visual and conceptual synthesis. Imagine Renaissance anatomical sketches layered directly over high-frequency angular velocity charts.
Oh, wow, that's such a striking image.
Right. Conexa isn't just using art as some cute metaphor. They're using the geometry of Renaissance painting to expose a fundamental flaw in how we measure force production today.
So our mission for this deep dive is to basically decode the physiological architecture of what we casually just call grace. We need to examine why those isolated ballistic gym routines you see everywhere might actually be short-circuiting our kinetic chains.
And we'll explore the extreme precision Conexa uses to capture these invisible micro-hesitations in the nervous system. Hesitations that, frankly, predict systemic failure months before a ligament actually tears.
Which is huge for anyone listening who is an athlete or just wants to move without pain. So the central thesis presented by Dr. DeLong in Kinetic Formation is that true athletic mastery has almost nothing to do with generating more force.
Or adding more load, yeah.
Right. Peak efficiency is strictly a process of subtraction. It's the removal of this invisible neurological friction that the body has subconsciously layered over its natural mechanics.
Okay, let's unpack this apparent contradiction, starting with Kinex's primary avatar for this whole concept, which is Botticelli.
Right, the painter of absolute lightness.
Exactly. In the art world, he's the undisputed master of it. When you look at the Birth of Venus or Primavera, the figures seem, entirely untethered from gravity.
Yeah, they appear like they're born from a sudden breath of wind.
But the dossier introduces this brilliant, highly technical concept here. They call this visual lightness a learned lie.
Wait, really a learned lie?
Yeah, that specific phrasing is critical
Yeah.
because it completely shatters the myth of spontaneous genius. We look at a Botticelli canvas and we perceive this fluid, effortless stroke.
We just assume the gesture flowed right out of him in real time.
Exactly. But the historical reality of the Florentine workshop was brutally rigid. That perceived lightness is actually the end product of exhaustive, mathematically grueling preparatory sketches.
Wow.
Yeah, Botticelli would map the skeletal geometry, calculate the torsion, correct the axis, and redraw the underlying musculature dozens of times before ever laying down that final, seemingly effortless line.
So it's basically the illusion of a system operating at ultimate computational efficiency. I mean, think of a duck gliding smoothly across a pond, right? Above the water, it looks totally serene. But underneath, those little legs are paddling furiously.
Or a virtuoso pianist who makes a wildly complex sonata look like a casual stroll across the keys.
Yeah. Or think of a tensegrity structure handling a massive wind load. To the observer, the bridge just gently sways. It looks entirely relaxed.
But At a microscopic level, every single cable is highly tensioned.
Exactly. Perfectly distributing the kinetic energy so no single joint takes the shearing force. The effort hasn't been eliminated at all. It's just been completely distributed.
What's fascinating here is that distribution is exactly what Kenexa identifies as the paradox of
Now the
mastery.
paradox of mastery, I love that.
Right. True lightness, that natural ease we associate with elite performance, is actually the ultimate reward of intense, invisible labor.
So in a biomechanical context, what does that actually mean?
It means the effort has been absorbed into the nervous system through the heavy myelination of neural pathways. The motor engram is so thoroughly established that the conscious brain just no longer intervenes.
So the paradox is that achieving a state that looks perfectly natural requires a deeply unnatural, almost pathological degree of systemic preparation.
Exactly. Which takes us right out of the art gallery and directly into the performance lab. The dossier states that Kinexa's entire physiological philosophy hinges on this paradox.
Right, because when they're analyzing an elite runner or a tennis player, the goal is never just to increase raw horsepower.
No, not at all. If a system is leaking energy, dropping a bigger engine into it just makes it tear itself apart faster.
That makes total sense. They are trying to restore that integrated Botticelli state where the architecture of the gesture is so optimized that the muscular effort completely vanishes from the naked eye.
Because frankly, brute force is metabolically disastrous.
Oh, for sure.
If an athlete relies on conscious cortical overrides to just muscle their way through a movement, they are burning ATP at a wildly inefficient rate. They're creating localized fatigue.
But when the effort is seamlessly integrated across the fascial slings, when it becomes that learn lie, the movement achieves supreme economy.
Exactly. The athlete accelerates faster and operates closer to their absolute threshold without that cascading accumulation of fatigue, precisely because the internal resistance has been mapped out and eliminated.
Okay, so let's trace the actual geometry of that efficiency, because the dossier spends a significant amount of time on a specific art history term.
Ah, yes. The term Botticelli utilized to create those weightless forms.
Right, the figura serpentinata, the
Yeah.
serpentine line. And Kenexa traces the lineage of this geometric concept through history.
We do. Michelangelo amplified it to express divine tension.
Yeah, and then in the 16th century, the theorist Lomazzo described it as the flame of fire that spirals upward.
Beautiful phrasing.
And by the 18th century, William Hogarth formally categorized it as the line of beauty, arguing it is the only structural line that inherently contains kinetic potential within a static frame.
Because it fundamentally rejects the static grid. The figure serpentinata isn't a straight, rigid vector,
Right.
nor is it a perfectly enclosed neutralizing circle. It is a continuous curve that shifts its axis, constantly alternating between tension and release.
But I mean, if we assume the perspective of a sports scientist analyzing ground reaction forces, the immediate skepticism is pretty obvious.
Sure. Yeah.
Why does a visual aesthetic, like a compositional trick to draw the eye across a canvas, why does that matter to someone measuring kinematic sequences? What does an aesthetic theory offer to the mechanics of a 100-meter sprint?
And that's exactly where Dr. Delong and Kenexa formation make their most aggressive conceptual leap. They translate art theory directly into empirical biology.
Okay.
The dossier argues this line encodes a hard physical reality. The figura serpentinata visually maps a double torsion. It represents a system maintaining a controlled imbalance between two opposing forces.
Opposing forces that are fully engaged without neutralizing each other's kinetic potential.
Precisely. So we are talking directly about co-contraction ratios, the precise management of agonist and antagonist muscle groups.
Right, okay. So in a highly simplified mechanical model, if the agonist pulls, the antagonist should theoretically shut down entirely to allow free movement, right?
Theoretically, yes. But human biomechanics are exponentially more complex than that. In a state of elite fluidity, opposing muscle groups contract simultaneously.
It's a highly calibrated dynamic tension.
Exactly. The antagonist maintains a very specific, fluctuating degree of tension to stabilize the joint capsule and guide the agonist's vector.
Which prevents energy from leaking out through lateral shear.
You got it.
It's a continuous, real-time negotiation across the joint. Like, if the antagonist drops to zero tension, the joint destabilizes and you get a microscopic hyperextension.
And if the antagonist holds too much tension, the joint binds up and the athlete looks rigid.
And that precise, optimal ratio of co-contraction is exactly what Kenexa is trying to isolate.
Yes. When that neuromuscular ratio is dialed in perfectly, the gesture becomes incredibly robust yet completely supple.
So Botticelli's figura serpentinata is essentially, centuries before electromyography even existed, the perfect visual map of an optimized co-contraction ratio. The line holds immense tension, but it never binds.
It is astonishing that he instinctively painted a biological imperative that we now need high-frequency sensors to validate.
It really is. Like when you visualize an athlete in a profound state of flow, say a gymnast mid-rotation or a point guard weaving through a defense.
Yeah, their musculature is incredibly tense, but the distribution of that tension is so symmetrical across opposing forces that the movement looks like fluid dynamics.
It looks like water navigating a riverbed.
And that symmetry is the foundation of kinetic economy. With an optimal co-contraction ratio, the nervous system isn't wasting metabolic resources frantically firing microcorrections to stabilize a flailing joint.
The balance tension creates a rigid, yet flexible conduit. The kinetic energy generated by the ground reaction force travels up through the fascial network without dissipating into the surrounding tissue.
But, the Conexa dossier highlights a critical parameter regarding how Botticelli rendered this tension. He fundamentally refused to paint bodies at rest.
That's a great point. Venus is captured in the exact millisecond of arriving on the shore.
The Graces in Primavera are actively turning their center of mass.
Yeah, the wind god Zephyrus is fully committed to the act of blowing. The figures have no discernible static origin point and no terminal resting phase. They exist entirely in transit.
They are suspended within a continuous kinetic flow. And Conexa leverages this observation to mount what is, frankly, a devastating critique of modern physical training paradigm.
Oh, the gym problem.
Exactly. The dossier posits that contemporary fitness, the standard architectural logic of the modern gym, has completely eradicated this concept of continuity from the human nervous system.
Because the structural logic of the gym is entirely fragmented? I mean, think about the mechanical rhythm of a deadlift or a bench press. It's a digital square wave.
You generate an explosive concentric impulse, you hit a dead stop at lockout, you manage controlled eccentric descent, and you hit another dead stop.
The dossier classifies this as ballistic movement, an isolated spike in force production, immediately neutralized by a static pause. It's like driving a car in heavy stop-and-go traffic.
Compared to Botticelli's movement, which is like hitting a perfectly timed series of green lights on an empty highway,
Yes.
that ballistic movement is the total antithesis of the figura serpentinata. By stripping out the continuous curve, where the deceleration of one phase elastically loads the connective tissue to initiate the next phase, we have normalized movement isolation.
We have basically trained the nervous system to view movement as a series of disconnected binary events.
It's the difference between an analog sine wave and a digital square wave. When you force a biological system to operate in digital ballistic stops and starts, you completely negate the stretch-shortening cycle.
You aren't riding the kinetic momentum. You are constantly paying the metabolic tax of overcoming dead inertia with every single rep.
And the metabolic and neurological consequences are profound. Conexa argues that by continually enforcing these fragmented ballistic actions, we replace the living line of elastic kinetic flow with a heavily managed sequence of neurological interruptions.
We are literally conditioning the central nervous system to hit the brakes.
Over a macro cycle of training, the body actually unlearns how to trust its own momentum. The proprioceptive map adapts to anticipate the static pause, which inhibits the fluid transfer of energy.
And when the nervous system stops trusting momentum, we encounter the primary pathology Conexa is designed to diagnose.
Right.
The dossier introduces the concept of a flow signature under interference.
This is a key concept.
It really is. This is the specific physiological state where that perfect co-contraction ratio fractures. And the interference could stem from anywhere, right?
Anywhere.
Yep.
A chronically guarded ankle sprain from a decade ago, postural adaptations from prolonged sitting, or simply the cumulative neurological rigidity of performing 10,000 ballistic isolated repetitions.
The continuous line shatters, and the fascinating thing is how this manifests visually. You can often spot an athlete suffering from this interference even if you lack the clinical vocabulary to describe it.
They don't present with an acute limp, and their power output might still look incredibly high, but their movement carries a strange, heavy latency.
It's a visual density. You watch them run, and it looks like the atmospheric pressure around them is slightly thicker than it should be.
Exactly. The hip extension at the apex of a sprint seems to drag for a microsecond, or the foot strike seems to brace against the ground slightly too early before initiating the toe off.
Right.
What your visual cortex is picking up, but your conscious mind struggles to quantify, is a flow signature under interference. You are watching the kinetic chain actively fighting its own protective reflexes.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The dossier delivers a really sharp indictment of the current sports technology industry.
Oh, absolutely.
We are surrounded by velocity-based training metrics, force plates, GPS load trackers, but almost all of these tools measure terminal output. They calculate the peak wattage, the total tonnage lifted, the split time on the track.
They are incredibly sophisticated tools for measuring what the system produced, but they are entirely blind to how the system organized itself to produce it.
Exactly. An athlete can squat 400 pounds at an impressive bar speed, and the algorithm spits out a green light. But beneath the surface, that specific kinetic chain might be heavily compromised.
The athlete's central nervous system might have detected a subtle instability in the left knee, instantly rerouted the force vector through the lower lumbar spine, and aggressively clamped down the antagonist muscles in the hip to prevent a blowout.
This system achieved the external goal, the 400 pounds went up, but the internal gesture was a chaotic, high-friction event.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it points to a fundamental rule of human physiology.
Yeah.
The central nervous system is an absolutely ruthless task completion engine.
It just wants to get the job done.
Right. If you demand a specific output, lift this load, run this speed, the brain will execute the command even if it has to bypass optimal biomechanics and leverage heavily guarded compensatory pathways to do it.
So those visual stutters, that heaviness we perceive, they are not necessarily localized muscular weaknesses.
And this is a crucial distinction. We usually assume a stutter in the kinetic chain means a muscle lacks the concentric strength to execute the phase.
But that is rarely the case at the elite level.
Rarely. More often, that hesitation is a historical artifact. The nervous system possesses a flawless memory.
Right, the body keeps the score.
Exactly. If an athlete suffered a micro tear in their hamstring 5 years ago, the brain learned to defensively break that joint a fraction of a second early to prevent catastrophic overextension.
And even if the tissue completely repaired and the scar tissue remodeled, the neurological software never deleted the protective subroutine.
Precisely. The hesitation is a persistent record of what the body has learned to fear, masking what it is actually physically capable of executing freely.
So we are dealing with an invisible software glitch. The naked eye can barely detect the heaviness, and standard output metrics validate the compensatory movement.
Yeah.
How does a biomechanist actually isolate a neurological fear response? This brings us to the operational core of the Kinexa formation dossier, their methodology for measuring the invisible.
And it is wild.
It is. They have architected a diagnostic system built on 3 specific pillars, driven by an almost absurd level of data density. They are running optical and sensor sampling at 200 hertz.
The resolution here is vital to understand. At 200 hertz, the system is capturing a distinct kinematic frame 200 times every single second.
They aren't looking at the macro movement, they are zooming into the microscopic intervals between conscious muscle contractions.
Which allows them to build their first pillar, the fluidity variance audit. Kinexa utilizes this 200 hertz data stream to track the angular velocity of the limbs with agonizing precision. They are specifically hunting for anomalies they term microspikes.
Okay, to conceptualize this, imagine the plotted graph of a pitcher's arm accelerating through a throw. In an optimal Botticelli-esque state of flow, that acceleration graph is a perfectly smooth parabolic curve.
But the fluidity variance audit detects high-frequency kinematic noise. A microspike is a millisecond duration event where the limb experiences a violent microscopic acceleration, immediately followed by a reflexive compensatory deceleration.
It is the literal neuromuscular stutter we were just talking about. The agonist fires, the brain panics for a fraction of a millisecond and clamps down the antagonist, then releases it again.
And because it occurs in a matter of milliseconds, it is completely imperceptible to a coach standing on the sidelines.
But to an optical array sampling at 200 frames a second, that microspike looks like a jagged earthquake on the velocity curve.
Exactly. Now, the second pillar targets the spaces between the movements, neural continuity mapping.
Right, because we discussed how Botticelli's figures never fully stop, they exist in the transition.
So Kinexa uses this mapping to analyze the exact latency in those transitions. The precise millisecond where an eccentric load absorption converts into a concentric force expression. They are isolating the micropauses where the nervous system hesitates before committing the kinetic energy to the new vector.
And the transition phase is where the most devastating energy leaks occur. If the stretch shortening cycle is interrupted by a neurological pause, the elastic energy stored in the tendons dissipates as heat,
And then the athlete has to generate entirely new concentric force from a dead start, which demands a massive, unnecessary spike in metabolic output.
which feeds directly into the third pillar, flow signature scoring. This is the real-time composite aggregation of the fluidity variance and neural continuity over time.
It gives you a macro view of the kinetic degradation over a training block.
But, if I'm an athlete, what does a dropping flow score actually feel like? I mean, I can't consciously perceive a 2-millisecond gap in my neural transition.
No, of course not. In isolation, a microspike is completely subperceptual.
Huh.
But physiological debt compounds.
Oh, great.
When an athlete accumulates thousands of these microscopic internal collisions and transition leaks over a 6-week training block, it generates a very specific, highly insidious form of systemic fatigue.
It's the friction tax. You are redlining the engine while dragging the parking brake.
That is the perfect analogy. The athlete presents with this mysterious lethargy. Their sleep hygiene is flawless, their macronutrients are dialed in, their blood chemistry is optimal, yet they report feeling stuck in mud on the court.
They hit a performance plateau that no amount of increased volume can break through.
Because the fatigue isn't residing in the muscle fibers. It is central nervous system exhaustion. The brain is utterly exhausted from constantly managing and overriding these invisible co-contraction failures.
This makes the flow score an incredible predictive tool. Dr. Delong's dossier emphasizes that a dropping flow score is a leading indicator of catastrophic failure.
It predicts a structural injury long before the mechanical stress actually snaps a ligament, because it proves the kinetic chain is already fractured.
Conversely, if an athlete's flow score begins to climb, it doesn't mean they magically synthesize new muscle mass, right?
No, it means a neurological restriction has been deleted. They ceased fighting their own protective reflexes, instantly unlocking trapped kinetic potential.
Which creates a fascinating operational challenge, which the dossier actually addresses in Section 6. The transition from abstract data to practical application. Like, how does a coach actually interface with this B2B technology?
Because handing a high-performance track coach a spreadsheet showing a 4-millisecond velocity anomaly doesn't change the athlete's movement.
Right. Conexa has to contextualize the data geographically and temporally.
Yeah.
And the granularity they provide to the practitioner is just wild.
It's unheard of.
They don't just generate a weekly summary saying, hey, your point guard's pelvic rotation is degraded. The system isolates the exact training session, the specific exercise, and the precise degree of rotation where the failure triggered.
They will tell a coach, on Thursday, during the 4th repetition of the transverse lunge, we recorded a severe neural hesitation at exactly 68% of maximum amplitude during the eccentric phase.
That level of spatial targeting completely changes the intervention strategy. You aren't guessing where the restriction lives, you have the exact coordinate.
And Kinexa mandates a very specific psychological protocol for coaches utilizing this data. It's known internally as the 3-minute rule.
Okay, what's the rule?
The execution is critical. The coach pulls the athlete aside, displays the angular velocity graph, physically points to the microspike, and asks one highly calibrated question. Did you feel anything at this exact moment?
Oh, wow. The phrasing there is doing so much heavy lifting. They explicitly do not diagnose the issue for the athlete. They don't say, your adductor is misfiring here. They just ask, did you feel anything? They're using the empirical data to force a recalibration of the athlete's internal map.
It is a profound manipulation of conscious proprioception. By asking the question, the coach forces the athlete's cerebral cortex to hunt for a sensory input that the subcortical reflexes had previously muted or classified as normal background noise.
It drags the invisible neurological stutter out of the subconscious and forces the athlete to confront the friction.
And it establishes a unified operational language. Anyone who has ever been coached knows the frustration of vague, outcome-based cues. A coach yelling, be more fluid, or drive through the hips, is meaningless to an athlete whose internal map already insists they are moving optimally.
But when you lock in on that specific coordinate, 68% into the amplitude, and the athlete suddenly remembers, wait, yes, I felt a tiny flutter in my knee right there, you have successfully bridged the data and the sensation.
The dossier is also adamant about the philosophical role of the technology here. Kinexa formation is not trying to automate the coaching profession. The 200 Hz data is not a replacement for human intuition. It is an amplification of it.
It's like functional MRI for movement mechanics.
Precisely. Returning to the Botticelli framework, Just as Botticelli required those hyper-precise, mathematically rigid preliminary sketches to eventually execute a stroke of pure intuitive freedom.
Right.
The modern coach leverages this hyperdense data stream to liberate their own intuitive coaching. By offloading the microscopic detection of kinetic leaks to the optical sensors, the coach is free to focus entirely on the psychological art of cueing, motor relearning, and human communication.
Which seamlessly transitions into the grand macro-level architecture of Kinexa's vision. Section 7 of the dossier zooms out significantly, revealing that Botticelli isn't just a quirky, one-off metaphor.
Far from it.
Dr. Delong and Kinexa are constructing a comprehensive grand unification theory of movement, using the entire spectrum of art history as their lexicon. And to establish the absolute boundaries of this theory, they juxtapose Sandro Botticelli with the 20th century abstract expressionist Jackson Pollock.
It is a jarring, brilliant dichotomy. You have the Renaissance architect of the continuous serpentine line, contrasted sharply against the chaotic, violent, purely ballistic output of modern action painting.
Kinexa utilizes these two artists to map the dual dimensions of human movement analysis. The taxonomy works like this. Jackson Pollock represents the gestural record.
His canvases are the raw, unfiltered trace of kinetic action. The paint splatters represent pure, uninhibited force production.
Right. The fundamental question Pollock's work asks biomechanically is one of intention. Does the raw power of my gesture successfully transmit what I intended to express?
It is the ultimate metric of output and velocity. But Botticelli represents the second dimension, the flow signature. It isn't merely about the magnitude of the force, it is about the structural integrity of the line carrying that force.
Botticelli asks the question of continuity. Does the kinetic energy flow unabated, or does the system subconsciously interrupt itself?
Intention versus continuity. Peak force versus structural economy. Kinexa's thesis is that true mastery requires both, but modern science has been exclusively obsessed with the Pollock dimension.
But what I find most compelling is the roadmap the dossier lays out for future biomechanical deep dives. They list a pantheon of historical and modern figures, using them to decode highly specific neurological phenomena.
The syllabus they've constructed is incredible. They propose a deep dive into Vaslav Nijinsky, the legendary ballet dancer, to dissect the biomechanics of the suspended moment.
Oh, interesting.
That analysis will focus entirely on the neurophysiology of deceleration, how the mastery of eccentric fluid absorption and the manipulation of terminal velocity creates the illusion of hovering.
They also bring Bruce Lee into the framework to analyze motor wu-wei, the concept of striking with devastating maximum power output while appearing completely relaxed.
Biomechanically, that requires the absolute mastery of selective motor unit recruitment, firing only the necessary fast-twitch fibers while keeping the surrounding tissue totally silent to prevent drag.
They also incorporate Rudolf Leben to analyze the spatial architecture of gesture.
And they introduce Isadora Duncan to explore postural liberation. That module will undoubtedly delve into the intersection of somatic psychology and fascial tension, how unresolved emotional states create rigid postural holding patterns that permanently alter a subject's kinetic expression.
They even map this onto modern athletics with Roger Federer.
The dossier treats Federer as the modern incarnation of Botticelli.
Because of course they do.
Exactly. Federer is their primary subject for grace under constraint. The elegance of his ground strokes isn't an aesthetic choice. It is the ultimate manifestation of perceptual anticipation and biomechanical efficiency.
His nervous system processes the ball's trajectory so rapidly that he never has to execute a panicked ballistic correction.
And finally, they list Martha Graham, focusing on the living contraction, analyzing how a deeply stabilized, highly activated core is the necessary rigid anchor that allows for absolute fluidity in the peripheral limbs.
So what does this all mean when we synthesize all of this, when we compile the 15th century Florentine geometry, the 200 Hertz optical data, the figura serpentinata, and the neuromechanical reality of co-contraction? What is the definitive conclusion of the Kinexa dossier?
Well, Dr. Delong distills this massive intellectual architecture into a single operational concept.
Anti-gravity.
Anti-gravity. The ultimate objective of Kinexa formation is not to teach an athlete a new mechanical skill. They aren't trying to program a robotic sequence or artificially boost force production.
Their core philosophy asserts that the line of beauty, the perfect uninterrupted kinetic flow, is the default biological state of a healthy human organism. It is already deeply encoded in your DNA. The role of the technology and the objective of the coach is entirely subtractive. You don't need to learn how to move with grace, you simply need the diagnostic tools to identify where you are subconsciously applying the brakes and the proprioceptive awareness to release them.
Exactly.
We have navigated an immense conceptual landscape today. We started with the realization that visual lightness is actually a learned lie, a state where immense effort is seamlessly absorbed into the nervous system.
We translated the aesthetic of the figura serpentinata into the hard physics of optimal agonist-antagonist co-contraction.
We examined how fragmented ballistic training environments destroy the stretch shortening cycle and condition our bodies to fear momentum.
And we dissected how Kinexa uses 200 Hz angular velocity sampling to drag invisible micromillisecond neurological stutters into the light, providing a pathway to restore the body's natural continuous line.
The profound takeaway is that true physical mastery isn't about moving harder. It's about trusting your structure enough to stop fighting your own momentum.
This raises an important question, though, and I want to leave you with an extrapolation of that exact concept. We have spent this entire section rigorously locked into the domain of physical biomechanics. We've analyzed how the central nervous system refuses to forget a physical trauma, subconsciously layering invisible breaks and micro-hesitations into our muscular pathways to protect us from a threat that hasn't existed for years.
Right.
But the human nervous system does not strictly silo the physical from the psychological. If our bodies are this incredibly adept at embedding invisible protective stutters into our physical flow, what is the architectural state of our mental and emotional kinetic chains?
Oh, wow.
Where in your daily life, in your cognitive habits, your creative output, or your interpersonal dynamics are you operating with a psychological flow signature under severe interference?
That is deep.
Where are you constantly, subconsciously hitting the brakes out of an outdated protective reflex? And what would your velocity look like if you finally updated the map, released the antagonist, and just allowed the energy to flow?
That is a staggering concept to sit with. The blueprint for uninterrupted flow is already integrated into your system. The only variable left is whether you are willing to stop getting in its way. Thank you for joining us on this exhaustive deep dive into the Kinexa sources. Until next time, keep analyzing the data and go find your own uninterrupted line.